right, welcome back. We're in our third session today about interpreting the Bible, or how we should think about interpreting the Bible. And I want to start off with where we're at in our rubric. Remember, our rubric is the word paradise, which represents those four levels of interpretation that we see, right? Peshat, which is the sort of grammatical, linguistic level. What does the word say? Remez, which is sort of like what are the interpretations of that. And today we're going to be at the third level, Drosh, and then next time we'll be at Sod, at the last level. Okay, so Drosh stands for the moral or legal or homiletical things, right? So the way I want you to think about this is what's called Hume's Guillotine. So this is called Hume's Guillotine. Hume was a philosopher, a moral philosopher in the 1700s, about the same time as the founding of America. And he developed this idea. The idea that what is does not imply what ought. What do I mean by that? Okay, so we can have descriptive statements. The sky is blue. And then we know that there are moral statements, ought statements, which we might call prescriptive statements. The sky should be blue. Right? Just because something is true doesn't mean that the moral consequence of that is also true, right? So we can't go from the sky is blue to that it should have been blue, that it has to be blue. Why couldn't it have been green or purple or orange or yellow? Do you see what I'm saying? Right, so there's a break here, that's the guillotine, right? It's like something has come and chopped the connection between what is and what ought. Okay, why am I dealing with that? Because what we're talking about here is this move. The move from remez to drosh. That is the move from interpretation to application. Now, we have the benefit in that the text we are using is not simply a descriptive text. The Bible is also a prescriptive text. That is, it gives us statements of moral value, not just only statements of empirical value. That is, we don't just have descriptions of how the world is, the Bible also tells us how the world ought to be. Okay? So, but when we make that transition, we can only make that transition if we are sure that the statement that is being made in the Bible is in this column, that is, it's a prescriptive should application statement, and not a descriptive is interpretation statement. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. How can I know which kind of statement it is? Because sometimes those statements are not clear, right? So let's jump into that. Okay, so let me use my eraser, which is my hand, and then we will go into this. Okay, so when we look for a prescriptive statement, we are looking for what is called a modal verb. So what our modal verbs are. Okay, so we're going to go from the most stringent to sort of the least stringent, right? So our words might be like must, ought, should, could, might. Oops, I spelled might wrong. May, right? This is, on this end, we are on the strict sense. On this end, we are on the permissive sense. Okay, what do I mean by that? Let's use some statements, right? You must give me $5. You ought to give me $5. You should give me $5. You could give me $5. You might give me $5. You may give me $5, right? So I just switched out the modal verb in my sentence between the subject you and the predicate give me $5, right? And so those words here, these modal verbs, change something from a descriptive statement to a prescriptive statement, right? So if I dropped out the words entirely and I just used the phrase, you give me $5, that could be a statement of fact. You give me $5. Or that could be a prescriptive statement. You give me $5. Right? You see the difference? And so when we look at the biblical words, the reason why we have to start here at Pashon and move to Remes and then to Drash is because we first have to understand what the sentence is, what is the statement, before we can classify that statement in terms of whether it is a prescriptive statement, that is behind those verbs, or behind the context, we have one of these modal verbs, let me get the word out, or whether we only have a descriptive statement. Okay, so let me say it this way. Let's pick a biblical phrase that we could talk about. All right. How about love your neighbor? Okay, so the great command is you love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so where does that fall on my spectrum? First of all, is it a descriptive or a prescriptive statement? You love your neighbor. Well, I don't know if you've interacted with your neighbor, the person who lives in your town next to you, who doesn't take their garbage can out the right time, who lets it, who doesn't bring it back and it blows down the street when there's high winds, who parks their car on the street and blocks your driveway, who, runs their lawnmower at 8 o'clock in the morning, right? You might not love your neighbor in the sense of it is not a statement of fact, you love your neighbor. Okay, so now we can see that the phrase, since we know it is not descriptively true, that's the point I'm making. We know what the statement is, love your neighbor. We interpret the statement, love your neighbor. Is it a statement of fact or is it a statement of value, right? So we're again talking about, is it a fact or is it a value? That's the other way you can think about that is ought question. Is this a statement of fact? No, it is not a statement of fact. Thus, the statement in the Bible must be a statement of value. Okay, now we figure out where that value lies on our modal spectrum. Okay, is it a strict value or is it a permissive value? Right? Is it a what's called a regulative? We'll write that word down. Regulative, or is it a normative? A lot of terms here from philosophy. Regulative are the rules. That's like a speed limit. Normative are guidelines. That's like the tendency of people should be, the typical behavior, right? Okay, so here, what is love your neighbor? You must love your neighbor. You ought to love your neighbor. You should love your neighbor. I'm going to argue it's over here somewhere, right? We're probably here, near ought or should. Right? It's not quite so far over as a speed limit, like hook or crook, we're going to force you to do it, right? The moral value of the statement, love your neighbor as yourself, is at the level of ought or should. You ought to love your neighbor, you should love your neighbor, right? Now, in the discussion that Jesus is having with the scribes, I'm going to use my red marker, are interpreting that statement over here. Okay? They are interpreting as a could or might statement, a permissive normative statement. You could love your neighbor. You might love your neighbor, right? And that's the whole value behind the context that Jesus is saying, right? When Jesus says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor as yourself, he then goes on in that sort of antithesis to talk about what the people are doing, like what is the normative, and then showing that it is actually closer to this regulative end. Okay, let's get a different statement. We'll talk about that. Okay. What about keep the Sabbath holy? You know, it says it's one of the big 10 commandments, keep the Sabbath holy, 7 days you shall rest from, 6 days you shall work, and the 7th day you shall rest from your labor. But there's many formulations of it in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so where does this start? In Exodus chapter 20, it is over here. I'm going to write that down. Exodus, in chapter 20, in the Big Ten, the 10 Commandments, you must keep the Sabbath holy. Okay? And so it enforces this idea of the strict regular principle. What happens in the book of Deuteronomy when we have, it's the book of Numbers. I got my reference wrong in my head. In the book of Numbers, we find a man who breaks the Sabbath because he goes and he collects firewood on the day of rest. And Moses and the elders of the people, they go to God and they say, okay, what should we do? Right? You said, keep the Sabbath holy. Now, is that a strict statement or is that a permissive statement? Is that a regular statement or is that a normative statement? That's why we have the story, right? And so God comes back and says, oh, it's definitely a must statement. And what do they? He says, you have to now kill him and blah, 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 blah. And so then they, execute this man for breaking the Sabbath, okay? Now, what's interesting about that is that in the New Testament, Jesus moves the statement over here. In the Gospels, and it occurs in several different Gospels, the story does, Jesus is doing work on the Sabbath, quote unquote, doing work on the Sabbath. He heals people on the Sabbath. He raises people from the dead on the Sabbath. He has a lot of these examples in which he comes over here and he says, no, it's more of a normative statement. You could keep the Sabbath holy, or you might keep the Sabbath holy. You might keep the Sabbath holy. Now, you're going, okay, hold on. Whoa. What are you saying, Andrew? Are you saying that Jesus has changed the rules? I'm saying, no. What Jesus is doing by moving it into this category, when he heals on the Sabbath, what he is doing is he is emphasizing what the value is. He is interpreting the value, to bring it back to my keyword up here from my word paradise, is intended. What is the intention of the passage? So the whole context within the Gospels, when he heals the person on the Sabbath, and then they say, oh, you can't be doing that because that's work on the Sabbath, and Numbers told us you can't even pick up sticks. You can't even pick up sticks, that means you can't even you can't even heal people. It's a strict regulative statement. You must keep the Sabbath holy. And Jesus says, no. See, there's a higher value. The higher value is love of your neighbor. Right? See, even in that passage, Jesus is bringing us back to what is the governing principle of his law, which is love. And that love is that he's going to help this person out, and he has it in different ways. So one time when Jesus heals on the Sabbath, he goes and says, which one of you, if your donkey or your oxen falls into a pit, wouldn't go and pull him out? You're going to pick up a big beast of burden, and I'm just touching some guy and healing him. And why do you do that? Because it's not good to leave the oxen in the pit where it can starve or it can hurt itself or it's going to freak out and get stressed and die, right? You pull it out and do good for the animal. And if you're doing good for an animal, why would you not do good for a human, i.e. heal them? And so what he's showing is he's connecting on this spectrum how that must, ought, should, could, might, may spectrum works. He's talking about the examples of living out the commandment. that governing under one principle, love your neighbor, love the Lord your God with your whole self, governs over how this statement works, right? The statement, keep the Sabbath holy, is about love of God. But that love of God is also contingent, Jesus says, on the love of neighbor. Okay, now I gave this example to talk about how the fact-value dichotomy works, right? So now let's look back at another way of seeing this. We're just going to close it off with this, right? So our first step is to read the statement for itself. What does it, translate it? Remember we talked about that. Sometimes we have to translate it into our English language from the Hebrew, from the Greek, but we also have to translate it in our minds so we understand what it means. We have to break it down grammatically. Love your neighbor. What is the love, right? That's the first level. Then we're going to move up remez. We're going to interpret the statement, interpretation, right? And so that interpretation is we're going to look at it as first, whether it's an is or an ought, right? Whether it's a descriptive statement or a prescriptive statement. And then we're going to put it, let's say we do find it's a prescriptive statement, then we're going to put it on our spectrum and try to figure out where that is. Is it strict and regulative or is it permissive and normative? And then we're going to move from interpretation to application, right? Interpretation is just breaking it down grammatically, in context, with context clues, with references and cross-references. We talked about that last time. And now we're going to go on this journey and we're going to move over into application, right? We're going to move from what is to what must be, ought to be, should be, could be, might be, may be. And when we do that, we have to emphasize that the Scripture is then guiding not just our mind, but also our heart, right? So let me put that down. So our mind, our interpretation, is then going to guide our heart or our living. And I'm going to close with one passage. In James, we read, faith without works is dead. And that's a very confusing statement for a lot of people. But what that really is this. Faith, knowledge, interpretation must ultimately point us into works or deeds, right? What we do. We can't just leave what we learn and not have it transform us and the way we live, right? So the faith without works is dead. The faith without action is dead. The interpretation without action is dead. Interpretation without application is dead. Right, so that's how we're going to climb the pyramid. We're going to first have our translation, or we're going to read it and understand it, then we're going to interpret it, and then now we're going to get up to application. And like I said at the very beginning in our first session, this is where we should spend most of the time of our Bible study. We should spend most of our time at this drosh, moral, legal, homiletical, moral application level. This is where we're going to need to camp out. This is where when we study Scripture and it transforms us, this is where we're supposed to be. It's all fine and good to learn what it means grammatically. It's all fine and good to find the cross-reference and to build the case, right? But if it does not ultimately lead us to applying it to our lives, we have only gone partially up the building. We've only climbed partially into the paradise. We have only planted the trees in the garden, paradise. We have not reaped their fruit. Okay? So this is where we should spend most of our time, is at this application level. Look at where we are on this value system. The Bible is a value system document, not just a document of facts, of history, of science, of truth in an empirical sense. It is a source of value, of moral, practical, living truth. Next time we're going to climb to the last level. That's the one everybody wants to go to. We're going to talk about that. But I wanted to emphasize today how we look at Bible study. The focus and the intent and the end goal of Bible study is to get us to an application level. So I'll see you next time.